Good afternoon and welcome to the Champaign Public Library special event, Scrap, Excerpt, List, Making Indigenous Archives, presented in partnership with the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. My name is Trisha Duzan and I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Champaign Public Library. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I wanted to update you and let you know that we are now open to the public. And we have a grab and go browsing model, and we have 1 hour computer sessions available to the public. The main branch is open from 9 to 6, Monday through Saturday, and 12 to 6 on Sunday. Our Douglas branch is open 10 to 6, Monday through Friday, and Saturday from 10 to 4. Please visit our library website at champaign.org for more information. Our moderator today is Dr. Kate Coker, who is the co-editor of the Women in Book History Bibliography, the author of numerous essays on the history of genre, popular culture, and women in publishing. Kate was also part of our fantastic presentation team for the History of Witchcraft event, which we hosted back in October. Please welcome Dr. Kate Coker.
Thank you so much, Trisha. The Rare Book and Manuscript Library is thrilled to again work with Champaign Public Library, and we are very excited that Dr. Kelly Weisskopf is joining us today. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes for those of you at home. What we're going to do is Dr. Weisskopf will present her lecture, and then we'll start more of an open conversation. If those of you at home have any questions you want to share, you can do so through the chat function on YouTube, and we'll be keeping an eye out for your questions. Dr. Kelly Weisskopf is an associate professor of English at Northwestern University. She is a scholar of Native American literatures, early American literatures, and science and literature in the Atlantic world. Her talk today is drawn from her book, Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures, which is forthcoming later this year, and I can't wait for it. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Weisskopf.
Thanks, Kate, for that introduction, and thanks so much to Trisha and Tracy at the Champaign Public Library for inviting me to give this talk. I could not have written this book if it were not for libraries and librarians, so I am so happy to be joining you today. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides and images to share with you. So I'm going to share that and then get started. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Ho-Chunk, Miami, and Menominee nations here in Chicago. I also want to just start with the words in my title to talk about what things like scraps, excerpts, and lists have to do with Indigenous archives. So you may think first of institutions when you think of archives, the libraries that hold rare books and manuscripts, the papers that offer a material connection to other times, places, and lives. In the United States, the history of archives goes back to their foundings in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is a history that's deeply interconnected with the literatures and lives of Indigenous people. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson called for libraries to be established where US settlers would place lists containing words in Indigenous languages. Jefferson theorized that these libraries were necessary because they would allow people to study Indigenous languages. In his mind, the word lists were kind of windows or portals that would give readers access into the ancient past. It was libraries and archives in Jefferson's vision that would hold Indigenous people's languages and literatures after the people themselves had vanished, an event that Jefferson and other Americans anticipated in the near future. While that hasn't happened, we can see the legacy of Jefferson's vision for archives in the US play out throughout the next several centuries as government officials and private collectors created galleries, museums, and historical societies with the goal of displaying Indigenous belongings in ways that would allow US settlers both to contact and have interaction with traces of people they believed were disappearing, and to test out their ethnographic and racial theories about deep time and humans in North America. So we can think here about archival institutions like the Massachusetts Historical Society, founded in 1791, the New York Historical Society, founded in 1804, the American Antiquarian Society, founded in 1812, along with countless other local and state historical societies. We can also think here about public museums like the Smithsonian, the Peabody Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Field Museum. All of these institutions dedicated themselves to collecting and preserving Indigenous objects, documents, and languages the settlers deemed authentic and ancient. And they did this out of a conviction that the people who'd made and used these objects would eventually no longer be present. People envisioned archives as portals into the past, and they relied on archives to manage the bureaucratic, administrative elements of colonialism. So we can see this way in which people are imagining archives as portals here in this quotation from a guidebook to Washington, DC, that describes Thomas McKinney's Indian Gallery. So this is a collection of portraits of Indigenous diplomats and leaders, as well as material culture items that McKinney kept in the offices of the Department of War. He is the Superintendent of Indian Affairs at this moment. We can see the ways in which archives manage the bureaucratic administrative elements of colonialism in this quotation from John Wesley Powell, who was the director of the Bureau of American Ethnology. And in the 1880s, he believed that making classifications of Indigenous languages would provide a basis through which to classify Indigenous people into nations and then to group them onto reservations. Over the last few decades, libraries, archives, and museums have begun to grapple with and address this history of colonialism to which they're connected, and to work to build relationships with Indigenous communities. As many scholars of the history of anthropology and of museums have shown, these decolonizing efforts have their origin in the early 20th century in political activism and advocacy from Indigenous intellectuals who were both activists and anthropologists. So here's where we get to the other words in my title. I started this book project wanting to think about how Indigenous books and manuscripts came to reside in libraries and archives, where scholars like me might read them. And I wanted to ask as well, how the stories we tell about the past might account for the fact that our sources often exist and are often accessible to scholars because of projects like Jefferson's, McKinney's, and Powell's. That is to say, projects deeply entangled with assumptions about Indigenous peoples vanishing and with efforts to bring about that disappearance. I especially wanted to undertake this project as a non-Native scholar whose research and teaching relies on colonial archives and the stories about the past that they make available to me and my students. In the process of working on this book, however, I came to understand that there was another story about archives and their making in the 18th and 19th century. A story that doesn't end with vanishing or disappearance. Instead, this story features archives made by Indigenous people within scrapbooks, on scraps of paper, in printed books, and in manuscript letters. This is a story about how Indigenous people experimented with gathering together excerpts and scraps from various sources, newspapers, magazines, books, and letters, among others. So we can think here of the Mohegan minister Samson Occam's list of recipes, made around 1754. It's a list that describes the features of plants and the illnesses they treat. And it's a list that has to be read in relationship to a particular place, plants, and bodies in order to use it. We can also think about the list of vocabulary words that Abenaki leader Joseph Laurent made in 1884. It's a list that doesn't represent a dying language, but Abenaki people hunting, writing, painting, playing music, and traveling North America and the Atlantic Ocean. Imagined dialogues in Abenaki and English evoke conversations among bilingual speakers, envisioning not just the survival of the Abenaki language, but also English speakers learning Abenaki. And there's also the Yavapai Apache physician Carlos Montezuma's scrapbook of newspaper clippings from the early 20th century series called 50 Famous Indians. Now, each installment in this series tells the story of a famous Native person, often leaders well known for resisting colonialism. And each story attempts to realize settlers' anticipation of Native vanishing by concluding with an individual's death. So the series provided a weekly disappearance, casting Indigenous people as existing only in history and in the imaginations of consumers of mass media, like the newspapers in which the series appeared. But Montezuma excerpted the clippings from the newspapers in which they were published and placed them into a scrapbook that someone originally used for Latin homework. In doing so, he made possible multiple ways to read the stories. Rather than being meditated by the pace of a weekly newspaper or a monthly magazine, in the scrapbook, the entries can be read straight through in one go. They can also be read by jumping around in nonlinear form. The reader gets to choose their own way through the scrapbook. Each of these texts is made by excerpting, collecting, and arranging materials from Indigenous and sometimes also colonial sources and placing them into arrangements that generate new readings, experimental meanings, and conclusions that resist their original contexts. So in the book that I'm writing, I call these intentional assemblages Indigenous compilations, and I want to talk through a number of their identifying features here. Indigenous compilations are made by repurposing what we call documentary or ready-made forms. So these are forms like the list, the album, the scrapbook, and the recipe, forms that are made on purpose to receive and store information in the way that an account book anticipates someone writing numbers, adding debits and credits to it, or the way a scrapbook's pages are laid out to allow items to be pasted in columns. These documentary and ready-made forms are everywhere in the 18th and 19th centuries, but we tend not to pay too much attention to them except as historical sources, because they don't seem to elicit creativity, authorship, or reading in the way that more evidently literary texts like a novel, an autobiography, or a poem does. But despite this reputation for being kind of boring and utilitarian, Native writers repeatedly picked up these forms and made new texts out of them by drawing on their capacity to make meaning through juxtaposition. So this means that placing excerpts near each other on the page puts them into relationship with one another, urges us to read them as having a relationship, and generates new meanings out of the shared space that those materials share. Indigenous compilations took up the documents with which colonists were making claims about Indigenous peoples vanishing, and they took those documents apart, critiqued them, and reimagined how the archives of Indigenous literatures might be made and used. Indigenous compilations are experiments in translation, combination, and recirculation. They make archives on the page, and they intervene into colonial archives and the forms of knowledge they produce. Finally, Indigenous compilations are archives not of static pasts, but of exchanges. They illuminate the many people who participated in making, reading, and using Indigenous literatures, but who often remain on the sidelines of literary histories because they don't figure as authors or editors. So today I want to take you on a tour through some Indigenous compilations from the Great Lakes. I'll begin with poetic scraps and excerpts assembled in albums on Ojibwe territories in what's now northern Michigan. And then we'll move south to compilations made from excerpts of colonial histories in what is now Chicago. So the first set of compilations is a series of albums that contain poems and songs, kept by Ojibwe siblings at the Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The albums illuminate some of the reading and translation practices with which the siblings engaged in English, French, and Ojibwe literatures. And the second compilation circulated at the 1893 Columbian Exposition and World's Fair in Chicago, and it explicitly presents itself as a model for how to read the archives of colonialism. I will conclude the talk by thinking briefly about some of the resonances of Indigenous compilations in contemporary archiving projects. So first, I want to take us north to the Ojibwe place called Boating, or what's now called the Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, where we'll start with albums made by the Ojibwe woman, Charlotte Johnston. She's the daughter of an Irish trader and an Ojibwe woman, and she's the younger sister of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who you see in the image here. You might know Jane Johnston Schoolcraft as an Indigenous poet, a 2007 collection edited by the literary scholar Robert Dale Parker. And if you're watching from the University of Illinois, he's your colleague. He put Johnston Schoolcraft on the literary map as what he calls the first known American Indian literary writer, the first known Indian woman writer, by some measures, the first known Indian poet, the first known poet to write poems in a Native American language, and the first known American Indian to write out traditional Indian stories. So that's Jane. But her younger sister, Charlotte, remains a much quieter presence, largely overlooked and unknown. This is in part because the things that Charlotte produced resemble assembling and gathering more than authoring. She collaborated on, translated, transcribed, and recirculated already existing texts rather than writing original poetry. Between 1826 and around 1850, Charlotte Johnston kept 2 albums. And you can see the title page for the first album on the left. The cover and title page for the second album are on the right. So these are albums, they're blank bound books in which she compiled poems and hymns in English, French, and Anishinaabe-Moan. So that's the Ojibwe language. She compiled these poems and hymns from people traveling through and visiting her home. One album, the one on the right, is untitled, and it's filled with about 80 previously published poems and a few illustrations. The second book, this is the one you see on the left, she titled Charlotte Johnston's Ojibwe Book, 1828, and it includes contributions made primarily between 1827 and 1833, as well as a cluster transcribed in the 1850s. Some poems in the books are by well-known authors, such as the English poet Lord Byron or the English hymnist Charles Wesley, and most, but not all, had already seen publication in literary magazines and newspapers. Charlotte's album making was part of what seems to have been a family practice. Charlotte, Jane, and their older brother George Johnston each made several albums over about 5 decades, in which they experimented with translated English and Anishinaabe-Moan words and stories, and with bringing poems, plants, and languages into relation on the pages of their books. So George Johnston, the oldest brother, kept multiple albums, which he calls memorandum books, between 1815 and 1857. He fills them with excerpts of texts he copied out of books in his father's library, accounts related to his work as a trader and Indian agent in the Great Lakes, journal entries, and transcriptions of Ojibwe stories. One book bears the faint traces of plants once pressed between pages of journal entries. He also devoted entire pages to pressing plants, identifying their Anishinaabe-Moan names, and adding recipes for plants' medicinal use. So you can see here in these images the faint traces of those plants. Jane also compiled several poetry albums, transcribing hymns by an unidentified author and gathering her father's poems into a manuscript book that she titled Poetic Remains. Between 1826 and 1827, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft also collaborated with her husband to edit the manuscript magazine Mosinigan, or Literary Voyager. You can see the title page for one of the issues in the middle here. This is a literary magazine that circulated mostly among family and friends at the Sault Ste. Marie and in Detroit, in Mackinac, and to some of Henry's contacts in the East. Unlike her siblings, Charlotte Johnston transcribed few of the entries in her albums herself. Instead, she opened the albums to solicit contributions from her family members and friends, and from the men and women traveling through the Sioux, tourists, soldiers, government officials, missionaries, and traders. And Charlotte rarely added her own writing alongside others' contributions. Instead, Johnston's albums reflected and generated social exchanges. Now, it's not all that uncommon to keep a scrapbook or poetry album in the 19th century. Many white US women made them. But what makes Charlotte Johnston's albums unique is that she is creating poetic archives at the same time that tourists and government officials are trying to collect her as a specimen of Indigenous femininity. Government officials like Thomas McKinney, so he's the man I talked about earlier who kept the Indian Gallery in his offices, and he meets Johnston in 1826 in his travels to Fond du Lac in Wisconsin for treaty negotiations. And McKinney described Charlotte as what he called a beautiful specimen of a female of mixed blood. And then he went on to dissect and catalog her features. A British tourist, Anna Brownell Jameson, sent Charlotte a list of questions about Indigenous women and plied her with questions about Charlotte's family. So if Charlotte's album created opportunities for social exchanges and interactions, US and British settlers sought to transform those exchanges into one in which Charlotte's body, family history, and even the songs and poems she might share in those exchanges risked becoming a specimen that could be removed from her and placed in an archive. McKinney's a good example of this. He described one of the songs that Charlotte shared as a wildflower, and he asked a correspondent to, as he said, let it not blush unseen, nor waste any of its sweetness. In other words, to ensure both its preservation and its availability to study. McKinney's metaphor of a wildflower too, in order to describe Charlotte and other Indigenous people and their literatures, suggests that they are fated to fade, wither, and vanish. So in this context, Charlotte's albums, filled with poetic scraps and excerpts, illustrations, and notes of friendship and affection, might seem like objects of insufficient force against colonial desires to make Johnston herself into a specimen, and to defend against the attack on Indigenous women's bodies, and by extension on Indigenous lands, political systems, and environmental knowledge. But in her albums, Johnston made a poetic archive that treats poems as shareable texts that can exist in multiple versions and to which there might be multiple responses and meanings, not limited to those that colonists imagined. So I want to give you two examples of how this happens. First, we can see this in the multiple versions of a poem about an Ojibwe woman and an American man in Charlotte's albums. Thomas McKinney collects and prints a version of that poem in which the Ojibwe woman is mourning unrequited love from an American man who leaves her behind. And that's the version you see on the far left here, the one that's printed. But at least 3 more versions exist in Johnston's album, and you see the other 3 here. They're the ones in manuscript. And each of these different versions are from different contributors. In those poems, the story is remade into one about an Ojibwe woman who is remembered, or who makes her own decision to turn away from and reject the American man, rather than being left behind by him. The poems contributed to Johnston's book write back to McKinney's version. They revise that version and reject its vision of an Ojibwe woman who sadly mourns her own disappearance. At the same time, it's the acts of exchanging and reading the poems, the collaborative work of assembling the album. These acts create relationships and exchanges of feeling that remain at odds with and uncaptured by colonial specimen and archive making. Johnston also used her albums to translate between English and Anishinaabe-Moan. In the Ojibwe book, she gathered hymns in Anishinaabe-Moan and English, and she probably used these hymns in her work as a translator for several Protestant missionaries in the 1830s. In those cases, she used her knowledge of multiple languages, as well as what many people described as her fondness for singing, to invite other Ojibwe people into her home. She provides care for them when they're sick and lonely, and she brings them into new relationships and shared feelings of affection. This is a page that is a translation by Charlotte of the Lord's Prayer. And in it, she doesn't simply translate words and sentences, but concepts from English and Anishinaabe-Moan, and from Christian theology into Anishinaabe philosophies. A contemporary retranslation of the poem by the Ojibwe literary scholar Margaret Noden shows that Johnston translates the prayer's emphasis on sin and the danger of falling prey to temptation into a prayer for living a good life and for respecting the Creator. So Johnston's albums transform instances in which colonists would make Indigenous women and their songs into specimen to preserve in archives and display cases, into occasions for multiplying versions of a poem, for repeating and rewriting a song until its original meaning is remade altogether, and for experimenting not with how Charlotte might adapt to English language poems and Protestant religious practices, but how those things might be translated to serve her own desire to make friendships among Anishinaabe people. So I want to turn now, leaving Charlotte behind, from her albums and their translation and circulation of colonial texts to take us to Chicago, to an Indigenous compilation that posits itself as disrupting colonial archives. And this Indigenous compilation is found in a birch bark pamphlet. The Potawatomi leader Simon Pokagon wrote and had the pamphlet printed in 1893 in the state of Michigan, where he lived on Potawatomi homelands. And he sold the pamphlet at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He for sure sold it on a place at that exposition called the Midway Plaisance. This is an area where organizers had set up living exhibits that were meant to replicate so-called exotic places. And he probably also sold the pamphlet throughout the fair's ethnographic halls and anthropological meetings as well. As you can see here, the pamphlet was printed with 2 titles, The Red Man's Rebuke and The Red Man's Greeting, and both seem to have circulated in Chicago in 1893. The digital scans here might be a little bit misleading. They might make it look like the pamphlets pretty large, but it's actually about the size of an adult's hand. So it's very easy to slide it into a pocket. It is printed on birch bark, as I said, and the pages, as Pokagon himself points out, are thin, tough, and paper-like. So the World's Fair, where Pokagon circulates and sells his pamphlet, the World's Fair is a key moment and site in the history of colonial archives. It's seen as a formative moment in the professionalization in the history of anthropology, and many of the objects on display at the fair formed the foundation of the Field Museum's collections. The fair is a place where the fair was a place where curators expected that Indigenous people would be on display, where they could read Indigenous people as part of American pasts. And there are lots of ways in which this happened at the fair. There are floats displaying scenes from American history, such as Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas, and scenes from Chicago's early history. And those floats have Indigenous people on them, playing not themselves, but characters in a kind of historical drama about the past. In addition, curators placed displays about Indian boarding schools next to exhibits they envisioned as representing the ancient past, in order to create what they called object lessons that would illustrate the different phases of civilization. So in other words, I think we can see the fair as a kind of massive display that's tried to solidify and make visible anthropologists' ideas about what they viewed as progress and as racial differences among peoples. Pokagon's pamphlet quickly became a collector's item after the fair in the late 19th and early 20th century. Its birch bark pages and its engravings drew book collectors' interests. Scholars who've written about the pamphlet have largely maintained this focus on the pamphlet's materiality, remaining fascinated by and focused on its birch bark pages, which they connect to histories of Indigenous writing. But this interest in the pamphlet's materiality has been in inverse proportion to readings of its content, which scholars have dismissed in various ways. They've read the pamphlet as problematically sentimental. They've suggested that it was a kind of last episode of Indigenous diplomacy. And in some cases, they've even suggested that Pokagon's publisher wrote the rebuke or the greeting. All of these arguments are inaccurate, and I can talk about them more in the Q&A if anyone would like. So today I want to turn us inside the pamphlet to look at its content. And one of the things we can learn by doing that is that the rebuke or greeting is composed in part of excerpts with which Pokagon seeks to teach people how to read. So Pokagon excerpted extensively from another book, Washington Irving's Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. This is first published in 1828 and then republished many times over the course of the 19th century. In Pokagon's hands, the excerpts from Irving's book serve both as a record of Columbus's voyage. This is something the fair is celebrating. 1893 is the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And so the excerpts from Irving's history allow Pokagon to comment on that commemoration. Pokagon selects quotations from Irving's book that describe the kindness of Indigenous people, their practice of holding land in common, and the prosperity and peace that characterized their communities when Columbus arrived in the Americas. But Pokagon doesn't reproduce or read these quotations straightforwardly. Instead, he illuminated the archival practices through which settlers were constructing histories of Columbus and colonialism, histories that were often partial or inaccurate. Pokagon does this in part by erasing his reliance on Irving's text. So instead of citing Irving, he urges his audience, and I've got this quote on the bottom right of my page here. He urges his audience to read the following left on record by Peter Martyr, who visited our forefathers in the days of Columbus. So here, Pokagon is altering Irving's text by suggesting that the Italian historian Peter Martyr visited America himself. As Irving correctly notes in his book, Martyr gathered information from colonist reports and documents to write some of the earliest accounts of Spanish colonization in the Americas. But by detaching Irving's name as author and suggesting that it was Martyr who traveled to the Americas, Pokagon invented archival genealogies. In this way, unmooring his account from European and US historians' obsession with Columbus's journals and other archival documents, which they were using to reconstruct histories of colonialism. Pokagon also uses his excerpts to rewrite Irving's text, and in particular, his description of Indigenous people in the Caribbean. For example, Irving attributed Indigenous people's deaths in the late 15th and early 16th centuries to their supposedly unchanging nature and even a desire for death, rather than to Spanish colonization. Irving explained that Indigenous people decided to withhold food from Spanish colonists and withdraw to the hills, where many of them died, he said, through famine, fatigue, terror, and various contagious maladies engendered by their sufferings. Pokagon described this history quite differently, departing from his sources even while still claiming he was quoting from a colonial history. He commented that your historians left to be perused with shame the following facts, namely that the Spanish treated Indigenous people with treachery and violence, using shocking means of torture and death. Rather than attributing Indigenous deaths to a refusal to work and to a weak nature, as Irving's book did, Pokagon identified enslavement, deception, and torture as responsible for the loss of Indigenous lives and homelands. In Pokagon's rebuke, excerpts serve both as a record of Columbus's voyage and, due to their origin in Irving's book, a record of the ways that US settlers were currently representing those colonial histories, constituting colonial archives, and formulating American literary histories. I think it's particularly significant that Pokagon selected excerpts of Irving's History of Columbus, given Irving's reputation as one of the first internationally recognized US writers and the centrality of his work in the 1890s to the nationalist literary histories that editors were formulating in anthologies and serialized magazines. Pokagon's compilation of pieces from Irving's text addressed not just Irving's History of Columbus and its popularity at the end of the 19th century, but the host of archiving, reading, and publishing practices through which US writers were producing histories of the continent. After excerpting from Irving, Pokagon then calls on his readers to adopt what might seem a surprising practice of reading colonial archives. He asks readers to pause here, close your eyes, shut out from your heart all prejudice against our race, and honestly consider the above records penned by the pale-faced historians centuries ago. Tell us in the name of eternal truth and by all that is sacred and dear to mankind, was there ever a people without the greatest reason of offense, more treacherously imprisoned and scourged than we have been? So in Pokagon's model of reading, we must pause and close our eyes in order to read histories of colonialism. This call to close our eyes doesn't mean turning away from those histories, but rather closing our eyes to the inaccurate, partial histories of colonialism and seeing clearly the effects of narratives of discovery and conquest on Indigenous people. Pokagon extends this representation of reading in his posthumously published novel, Queen of the Woods. It's published in 1899, where he describes a series of what he calls object lessons. These are objects that train their readers in how to see and use them. One such lesson occurs on a trip to Mackinac Island, where he examined the old Astor books. These are account books belonging to the American Fur Company. Pokagon remarked, "The handwriting is the plainest I ever saw. As I was examining them, I thought in my heart, if these books are ever required in the Supreme Court of Heaven as evidence against the white man for dealing out ishko to wabo, that is alcohol, to the red man, no experts will be necessary to read them." By arguing that the meaning of these account books should be clear to anyone who reads them, Pokagon doesn't necessarily mean that they're transparent or that their meaning is explicit. Instead, the account books, much like the colonial histories that he excerpted in the rebuke, generate reading practices that are capable of seeing the stark effects of dispossession and settlement on Native people. Pokagon's compilations imagined Native American literature's relationship to US national literary histories as one in which Native literary practices and material forms, like birch bark pages, recontextualized colonial archives, texts, and genres, insisting that they cannot be read without critical reflection on their claims about the past and about Indigenous people. At the same time, Pokagon's birch bark compilation, like Johnston's albums, encourages acts of recirculating and rewriting texts that produce new ways to read and understand them. Indigenous compilations are not stopping places for scraps and excerpts, but engines of circulation and recirculation. So I want to conclude by meditating for a moment on some of the stakes of a project that attends to 18th and 19th century archival formations, to the intersections between anthropology and Native writing, and to the ways that scholars read early Native American literatures. For me, as I gestured to earlier, one of those stakes is understanding how US archives have shaped our reading practices and our assumptions about the past. I think equally important is understanding the ways that Native writers have engaged in practices of creative textual use and reuse in order to turn a critical eye on colonial archives. These Indigenous compilations and their archival interventions generate perspectives from which to support archival creation, curation, and collaboration in the present. This might look like Native nations and organizations repatriating materials or copies of materials to their own cultural centers or repositories, or creating their own archives out of materials that never traveled outside of the community. In any case, archives continue to be central, not just to the preservation and production of memory, but also to the creation of alternate reading practices. And I'll close with just one example of this. This is a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize the American Indian Center of Chicago's archives of photographs. I was lucky to work on the project in 2017 and 2018 to create an online archive documenting AIC events from the 1980s and 90s. The work of digitizing was done by 2 college students who worked as interns for the project. And they curated the archive by digitizing the photos, adding metadata, and then creating exhibits. And you can see some of the exhibits here. The meanings of the photographs transformed as the interns took them out of the plastic bins in which they previously lived and digitized, labeled, and curated them, placing the photos into new relations that shared histories of the center from their vantage points as young women who'd grown up attending center events, but who were also seeing some of the photos from the 80s and 90s, that's the 1980s and 1990s, for the first time. If we see digitization as yet another form of using and circulating photographs, we can see the interns' work as continuing a long Indigenous practice of recirculating and assembling materials in order to make relations among community members, in this case, a large urban Indigenous community. These projects make digital recirculation a form of caring for materials, even as they generate new meanings for the documents that tell histories of Native organizations. The AIC's archives are qualitatively different from the archives with which I began this talk, as the center's archives were created by and for Native people. They hold materials that were created in order to tell the American Indian Center's stories on its own terms. But I think it's worth considering these community-created archives in relationship to the ways that people like Charlotte Johnston and Simon Pokagan made archives on paper and circulated texts in order to form relations, share knowledge, and speak in their languages. All of these Indigenous archives ask us to close our eyes to familiar narratives of the past and of American literature, and to see instead what stories and relations that assembled texts might circulate between, among, and outside Indigenous communities. So I'll stop there and look forward to a conversation with you and any questions that you might have. I will stop sharing my screen, and I think Kate is going to come back on with a few questions.
That was awesome. I can't thank you enough for like walking us through that. You know, one of the things I do as a rare book librarian is when we bring, well, and before times when we could have people in the library, what we would do is we would bring books out. And one of the things that I would try to explain is the idea that each book that we have is its own individual story, right? And that's something I think a lot of people, you know, in the 21st century, we can go to a Barnes and Noble or some other big bookstore and they'll have 30 copies of the same thing. And when you were looking at historical materials, it's not like that at all. Even if it's a very popular book, you are not going to have 30 copies of anything that look exactly like one another. Yes. So one of the things that I loved about your talk when you're looking at these things is just how this is literally embodied within the text. The Charlotte Johnston book, where she's making her own archive of poetry, and I mean, obviously this is falling within like a larger you know, lineage of you know, commonplace books and things like that. Yep. But the way all of these, the poems that she's collecting are turning around specifically back onto, you know, the poetry of these white authors. They're treating Indigenous people in a derogatory way. Yeah. And I think that's so awesome. And can you talk about it some more?
Sure. Kate, I was thinking about your own work and interest as I was putting this talk together and thinking about your work, especially with women's materials. So I'm super excited to talk a little bit more with you. One of the things that I am so struck by these texts that Indigenous people assembled and composed is the ways that I think they offer really good evidence for the ways that texts are made and the ways that they bear on their pages and on their covers the signs of the journeys that they take, whether that's from a printer or an original owner to other people, and then eventually into an archive. And one of the really interesting things for me about Indigenous compilations is that they bear the signs of their travels into colonial archives. That one of the things that characterizes them is that Indigenous people made decisions to put them into a colonial archive or to share them with a colonist or settler at some point. So we can see that with Charlotte's albums in the ways that she is at various points making decisions to share poetry with the white tourists who are coming through the Sault Ste. Marie. And so we see that reflected in the different handwriting across the books. We see that lots of different people are contributing, signing their names, sometimes not signing their names. We don't know who's contributing, but we do know that these are books that reflect collaboration. They reflect social interactions and friendships and exchanges. And they can also reflect the ways in which those friendships can be a site for power relations that get worked out on the page as well. We can also see this with the ways that Simon Pokagon takes up the category of the souvenir at the fair. So he's selling the pamphlets for about $1, and it's clear that some people bought them as souvenirs from the fair. And it's hard to know exactly what people thought they were purchasing, but it looks like, at least in a couple of cases, that it's a kind of souvenir of Indigenous people whom they expected not to be around much longer. So Pokagon kind of takes those expectations and the ways that he seems to have known that people were going to be interested in buying souvenirs at the fair, and uses that to do something really different, to circulate these pamphlets that critique the whole purpose of the fair and its celebration of Columbus, as well as the ways that US settlers are currently reading American history within this thing that is packaged as a souvenir, but contains this message and content that is very much at odds with the ways that lots of people expected the souvenir to work. I don't know if that's along the lines you're imagining. I'm of course happy to say more, but I'll stop and let you ask any follow-up questions.
I think that was great. Another thing that struck me about the Pokagon example is, this idea of him as an Indigenous writer, and he was a printer as well, right?
He's not a printer, and the question of who prints the pamphlet is actually super interesting. I'll say more. I can say more. But
I want to hear I want to hear about printing.
Well, I mean, it's really just to say that after I finished this book, I realized that lots of people asked me who printed the pamphlet, and that I could not answer that question. In part because I had wanted to focus on the content of the pamphlet and try to understand what he was up to within its pages. But then I started digging, and so I'm still kind of in the process of trying to nail down the entire story. But it looks like the local newspaper in Hartford, Michigan, where Pokagon and his publisher, C.H. Engel, live, printed the pamphlet. So I have lots of questions about how a local newspaper decided that they were going to print on birch bark, which is not the easiest process, I think. And lots of questions about who was involved. But that's my theory, that it is printed by the local newspaper. And so I think one of the things that tells us is that we need to think about Pokagon in relationship to histories of newspaper and periodical circulation. One of the things you can track if you look at newspapers, both in Chicago and kind of around the Midwest before the Columbian Exposition, is that there's kind of little bits of chatter or news about Pokagon and about the pamphlet, but also about the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians land claims, which they have just gone to Washington, D.C. and successfully argued that the federal government did not pay them properly for land cessions made earlier in the 19th century. So I think Pokagon is kind of paying attention to how newspapers are spreading information through these kind of circuits of reprinting, and he's drawing on that in order to produce the pamphlet. So that's what I know. There's still lots of unknowns, but that's that's sort of where I am on thinking through that. But does that get at your question? I feel like maybe you had something else you were.
Yeah, and as a reminder, folks at home, if you are watching through YouTube, you can put your questions into the chat there. I have a kind of a follow-up question, because what I was kind of thinking about, particularly right now, is kind of the relationship between, you know, librarians and, you know, and artists and craftspeople of color. And you know, we talk about archive making and things, and Friday, y'all, I am sorry. Talk about, you know, these relationships of archive making and so on. And over the summer, the kind of the height of the Black Lives Matter protests and so forth, I went to a Zoom lecture with Amos Kennedy was speaking, and he's a very well-known, very well-respected Black American printer. And one of the things he said that just has stuck with me, like, you know, all these months later, is he said that for our histories to be equitable, we would have to burn down all of the libraries. And, you know, as a librarian, as an archivist, that sets my hackles on edge, because, like, I have to protect all of the things. But I also have to acknowledge that, you know, as a site of power, as, you know, in Pokagan's words, a pale-faced historian, that, you know, there is culpability in the institutionalization of what we collect and so forth. And so I'm just wondering, like, do you have any thoughts about how these two things collide, where you have, you know, the power structures of Indigenous people and other marginalized peoples versus libraries and museums, and how they present this information?
Yeah. I think this is a good, important question. And one of the ways I've been thinking about it here in Chicago is around some of the work that the Field Museum has been doing to renovate its Native American Hall. So, you know, it's a museum and not a library, but it's nonetheless an institution that's trying to really grapple with its history as a natural history museum that's had people in it, and to do really good work with Native people, communities, and scholars to collaboratively revise their hall. At the end of the day, the institution is still a natural history museum, and it's still kind of producing knowledge in the way that a museum of natural history has produced knowledge for a long time. And so I think this question of, like, can institutions be made to produce different kinds of knowledge or objects or relations, or do we need different kinds of institutions, is a really important one. And I think there are, like, a whole spectrum of answers to that, right? Like, folks who would say the libraries and museums need to burn in order to build something else. And then, of course, other folks who are using those institutions for purposes that subvert them or turn them to other ends. I think one of the interesting things stories that I follow in the 18th and 19th centuries is this story about Indigenous people using libraries and museums for their own purposes. And that's not to say that they thought they should exist, but that they said, okay, these are sites of power, they exist, and I'm gonna write back to them or respond to them or criticize them in some way. And so that history of critique, I think, is really very old. And I think we need to go back to these really early moments to understand the forms of critique that are being made about libraries and museums in the present. I will say too that Amy Lonetree, who's a Ho-Chunk historian who has a book called Decolonizing Museums, makes the important point that there are tribal archives and museums. So these are Indigenous nations that curate their own collections and make their own institutions. And so those are often formed with very different purposes and practices in mind. So I think we can think not just about university or national archives and museums, but also the ones that tribal nations keep as places we might send support to and see as places for producing knowledge and making relationships, much in the same way that people making Indigenous compilations in the 18th and 19th century were doing on paper.
Looks like we've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Yep.
Someone notes they're a professor of history of children's literature, and they're curious, what age were Charlotte and her siblings when they made those scrapbooks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much. Let's see. So George is like late teens on up into his like 30s and 40s when he's making his scrapbook. Charlotte, I'm doing the math here really quick, is like in her 20s. So they're sort of like young adults when they're making these. Charlotte keeps her albums before her marriage to her husband, a man named William McMurray, and then after as well. Some of the entries are in his hand as well. So it seems that they are both kind of pedagogical objects, so things that they might have done as they're like learning to read or practicing their lessons, and that as they sort of grow and start to kind of build social circles, that they also become objects that they're using kind of in those social exchanges. I would say if you're interested in scrapbooks made by children, there are a couple of interesting places to look. So I write a little bit about John Ridge, who's a Cherokee writer, lives the same time that Charlotte Johnston does. And he goes to mission schools in the Cherokee Nation and also to a mission school in Cornwall, Connecticut, that's dedicated to educating Native kids. And he keeps a scrapbook or a commonplace book while he is in Connecticut. And it's a really interesting book. So like Charlotte, he doesn't write anything that's his own creation. He's copying poems, probably from a textbook that his schoolmaster had published. So it very much just seems like a book that reflects copying. But he also writes his own name 5 times throughout the book, each name a little bit different in its placement of flourishes and its emphasis. And so I think one of the things we can see with that book is the ways that Ridge is both copying, and kind of trying to adhere to the norms of penmanship and handwriting and neatness that's he's being taught, but also kind of figuring out how to represent himself within those constrictions and expectations. There's a great article by Karen Sanchez Epler about a friendship album from that school. And if you're interested, I can send you the reference for it. Feel free to send me an email. Thanks for the question.
You've got another question. How are these materials discovered? Donations or existing archives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some of them are really well known. Pokagon's Red Man's Greeting or Rebuke, as I said, is a book collector's item and is well known to many scholars. In a lot of cases, I found these items by looking in collections created by colonists. So they're often kind of hidden within those collections that are not named for the person who actually made the materials, but named for the person who ended up owning them. So it took a lot of help from librarians who knew their collections really well, a lot of digging through collections and not finding anything. And then eventually, once I started to kind of know where to look, a sense that I could look for things like scrapbooks. There are many, many, many vocabulary lists of Indigenous languages made by Indigenous people. And so that ended up being a useful place to look. But as I said, a lot of times this was serendipity. I ended up looking at Charlotte Johnston's albums because I was doing research on Simon Pokagon and ran across the microfilms of the albums and thought they looked really interesting. And then went to a public library in Sault Ste. Marie where they're held and looked at them in person and realized that the microfilms don't do justice to the beautiful colors and handwriting that is featured in the albums. So it's a little bit a story of how helpful librarians are and the ways that much research cannot be done without librarians who know their collections so well. It's also a story about the ways that lots of Indigenous literatures from the 18th and 19th centuries are held within collections made by colonists and named for those colonists. So I think it's also a story about the fact that there are many other texts that remain out there that are difficult to find because of the ways they've been cataloged and categorized don't lead us to the Indigenous person, but to the colonial collector instead.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you have any plans to extend your research outside of the Great Lakes region?
Thanks for that question. The book actually kind of has two chapters on the Great Lakes, so on Charlotte Johnston and Simon Pokagon. And then I also think about the Northeast. So Samson Occam, who's Mohegan, who writes a recipe book of medicinal treatments. He lives in Connecticut and in what's now Connecticut, and then also moves to Brothertown, which was in New York in the 18th century. It's now in Wisconsin. And then Joseph Laurent, he's Abenaki. He lives in at Odanak, a place called Odanak, which is within Quebec, Canada. And he travels across the US-Canadian border between New Hampshire and Canada. So it's a little bit of a Northeast and Great Lakes book. And I try to kind of think about the writers who are in each of those places as speaking to each other kind of locally across the kind of, or throughout the region that they live in. There is certainly, I don't mean to suggest at all that Indigenous compilations are limited to the Great Lakes, because they're certainly much more widespread than that.
Thank you. And I have another question. Like, you know, you're working with scrapbooks and you know, these archives as objects. And can you perhaps talk a little bit more about ways of thinking about archiving and what kind of other texts you think about with Indigenous literatures? Like, one thing I'm thinking of in particular that I read back in the fall was a graphic novel about the band Redbone. Yeah. And it was told as a mix. The story to told, you know, it's a graphic novel. It's a mix of you know, words and pictures. And one of the things I thought was amazing about it was how they ignored the idea of what we think of as, you know, classic American comic books where everything's in boxes, and instead all of the pictures were just kind of free flowing, and you could read in different ways. And it was just this kind of deconstruction of how we expect texts to be presented. Yep. And telling an Indigenous story. And so can you talk about you know, this kind of thing, archives and genre? Yeah,
I think there's a really fascinating, I guess we could say, like, collection or group of 20th and 21st century Native literatures, kind of thinking about archives as a genre. I like thinking about it in that way. So one book that comes to mind is Deborah Miranda's autobiography, Bad Indians, which is a personal autobiography, but it is also a kind of archive of the ways that Indigenous people in California are represented and the ways that school kids in California are taught to know California Indian history. And one of the things Miranda does is critique and take apart I think it's like a 4th grade lesson plan about the missions in California. And then she tries to assemble an archive within the autobiography for telling that history of California's Indigenous people in a way that does not have the kinds of biases and inaccuracies of the mission history. So she assembles things like photographs, historical documents, family memories, charts and graphs. So she's really making this kind of multimedia archive within the pages of her autobiography. So in that sense, it's both a kind of personal archive in the sense that it tells her own story, and a kind of collective tribal community archive in the sense that it's also telling the story of Indigenous people as well. And then I think I would also think about the really amazing flourishing of Indigenous poetry that's happening right now. And I think especially of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa poet Hyde Erdrich, whose books of poems are often, they often evoke archives. So she has a book, which the exact title is escaping me right now, but it's about, the title has to do with ephemera. So these kinds of pieces of things we wouldn't expect to keep, but maybe end up in an archive anyway. And the book of poems kind of gathers ephemera, things like a playlist from a tape made for you in college, for those of us who are old enough to have done that. The pieces of a tribal history or a story, or a kind of environmental archive about a tree. So I think there's also a lot of Indigenous poetry that's kind of thinking through the ways that poems can form archives on the page. That's just 2 examples, I think, of the ways that I think an archive as genre starts to take place in both fiction and nonfiction in the 20th and 21st centuries.
That is so awesome. We're at the bottom of the hour. I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank you so much for doing this with us. This has been so enlightening and interesting. And yeah, I cannot flail enough. Yeah. And so I'm sorry.
Oh, just to say thanks. This was super fun and really appreciated being in conversation with you.
Yay. And then to turn back to Trisha, keeping us.
Hi, and yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. That was amazing information. I'm jealous that you get to actually touch and feel and see all those archives and scraps, because I'm sure they, like you said, they're much more beautiful in person. So to be able to take advantage of that, see those, would be quite something. Thank you to Kate and University of Illinois, the Rare Book and Manuscript Museum. Oh my gosh, I can't talk either. It is Friday, so you know, we are making it through. But thank you. You know, we did want to let everyone know that this was being recorded today. We will have it up on our YouTube channel. And so, you know, you can share that with others that might be of interested in this information, or if you want to rewatch it, you know, you'll have that opportunity if you visit Champaign Public Library's YouTube channel, and you can always subscribe, and then you're in the know when we put out new content too. So, Kelly or Kate, do you have anything final you want to add to the conversation?
It's cold out there. Stay warm, folks.
Yeah, that's a good way to go out.
Yeah, I imagine it's not much warmer where you're at, probably worse. So, all right, well, thank you again for joining us today, and be sure to check out all of our webinars here at Champaign Public Library. Thank you.